What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 333 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about First X-Men. This is a 5-issue miniseries written by Christos Gage and Neal Adams with art by Neal Adams. The story here is that before the founding of the X-Men, Sabretooth and Wolverine are going around recruiting young mutants, trying to put a stop to the government kidnapping mutants and weaponizing them and turning them into tools for the government. They are trying to create a better life for the next generation of mutants. And then you have different X-Men characters that you will recognize if you're fairly familiar with the X-Men. Professor X, Magneto, they're both in here. Kind of minor characters like Fred Duncan from the 1960s X-Men comics, Bolivar Trask, who is the creator of the Sentinels. Basically, this is kind of sort of the movie X-Men First Class, but in comic book form, and with Wolverine and Sabretooth playing the Charles Xavier and Magneto roles. And whenever this first came out, I remember a ton of people saying that this was one of the worst X-Men comics that they had ever read. And now that I've read this, I don't think that it's the absolute worst thing that I've ever read concerning the X-Men. It is maybe in the top 5. I can very easily see how people would say that this is the worst X-Men story that they've ever read. Before I even opened the book, I was thinking that the premise of this, because I was familiar with the premise, but I hadn't actually read the story, I remember thinking the premise of this reminded me a little bit of the X-Men Spider-Man miniseries written by Christos Gage. And that was a story that I absolutely hated. And then I open up the book, and on the credits list here, we have Christos Gage as the writer. And that does not surprise me. This reminds me a lot of that. Both of these stories, First X-Men and that X-Men Spider-Man miniseries, are continuity implant stories where we go back to an earlier point in history and we're trying to fill in some of the gaps that may or may not have been there. And the problem with these continuity implant stories is that they require a whole lot of research to not feel like they were phoned in. In this case, I feel like Neal Adams and Christos Gage and maybe some editor who got these guys to do this story was saying, okay, we have this movie X-Men First Class coming out. It's about these older, more experienced mutants. They are working with younger mutants trying to save the day. Let's do a comic book kind of like that. Let's get the people who just watched X-Men First Class to come and read this story. The problem is, this is only going to work for people who have only watched X-Men First Class and maybe some of the other X-Men movies. Anyone who has read any X-Men comics at all, they are going to read this and they are going to say, I don't understand what's going on here. Even if you've never read an X-Men comic before, this is not a very good book. Let's go ahead and talk about the art real quick before I forget. Neal Adams is an industry giant. He is a legend for many reasons. He helped reinvigorate Green Arrow back in the late 60s, early 70s. He had a very fantastic run on Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where he kind of made them political polar opposites while still kind of making them best friends. He helped redesign and kind of make Batman a more interesting character, I guess you could say. Transitioned him from the Adam West era into a slightly darker, more realistic era in the 70s. He is known for doing a lot of that stuff. Even outside of his art, he was a huge champion of creator rights in comic books. He helped get that ball rolling in the 70s. So he is known for being pretty awesome in the world of comics. And here, his artwork just isn't very good. There are several moments in this book where I was just looking at this saying, like, it's really difficult for me to believe that this guy is known for being a legend in the comic book industry. There are several points here where I almost laughed at the bad art here. There's one cover here. It's an alternate cover, a variant cover that he did of Wolverine, and the proportions look all wrong. There's one point where Sabretooth is saying, oh, man, and his face looks like he was just told that they ran out of sausage pizza at Pizza Hut. That's the face that he has, but the situation there is that soldiers are surrounding him and are about to kill him and the rest of the team. So I feel like the art here isn't very good, and I don't think that's always been the case. I think that Neal Adams used to be a really good artist. The Green Lantern, Green Arrow stuff that I've read, I really like that quite a bit. He actually had a brief run on X-Men in the late 60s. There's this one page that I very distinctly remember, a Beast jumping out a window and coming down down towards the ground, but it's like the audience, or the camera angle, I guess you could say, is down on the floor, and Beast is coming down towards the camera. I remember that panel, and I remember that being very dynamic looking and very interesting. At one time, Neal Adams was a really good artist, but now I just don't think that he's really putting in that much effort. A lot of this just feels phoned in, and that's a word that I feel like I keep coming back to here with this book, because a lot of it feels phoned in. Let's talk about the story here. This is not very good. So basically the premise is that Sabretooth isn't that bad of a guy, and he and Wolverine are basically the mentors to this next generation of X-Men characters. Wolverine here, I guess, feels pretty consistent with how he's usually portrayed. He's the grumpy uncle with a heart of gold. That's how he's been since the 1980s. They pretty much have him down pat. But all of the other characters here, they feel like they are wearing the name of the character that they are supposed to be, but otherwise they do not resemble that character in any way. So we have Sabretooth here, who's just Wolverine's pal. That is inconsistent with everything else that we have ever been told about Sabretooth. And that's where I'm going back to. These continuity implant stories require a heck of a lot of research to pull them off. If you don't research everything about all these characters that you are going to use, then it is going to feel like you don't know what you're talking about and you're just doing a fan fiction story. That may be a little bit harsh towards people who do fan fiction. I have nothing against fan fiction, but a lot of times fan fiction stories will ignore pieces of continuity and pieces of canonical stories in order to do whatever the heck they want. And that's what I feel like is going on here. There are canonical stories where the first time that Sabretooth and Wolverine met each other, they got into a fight and they were instant enemies. This is pretty much ignoring that and saying that these two are buddies and that they're not that different. And then Sabretooth falls in love with this kid. That's really gross, by the way. He calls her jailbait the first time that they meet, and then he falls in love with her, and then he tells Wolverine, oh, she's 18, she can do whatever she wants. And I'm thinking, this is really sketchy and really gross. And I know it's Sabretooth, and he's supposed to be really sketchy and really gross, but you're portraying him as a protagonist in this book. You're trying to make him out to be this tragic anti-hero. It's very creepy and very gross. So anyway, you might have guessed, this girl dies, and that's what puts Sabretooth on the path to being Wolverine's enemy. This does not work as Sabretooth's villain origin story. I much prefer everything else that's been done with his backstory, where he was abused as a kid and his father tried to pull his teeth out with pliers and just had an extremely awful childhood, and then he had his mind messed with by the government just like Wolverine did, but he always just instinctively hated Wolverine. I think all of that is much more interesting than what we have here. I really don't care for this origin stuff for why Sabretooth became Wolverine's enemy. I don't really like that. Then at the end of the book, after everything is falling apart around Sabretooth and Wolverine, Fred Duncan, who was Professor Xavier's government contact in the Silver Age X-Men stories, he comes to Wolverine and says, hey, I'm in charge of mutant affairs now in the FBI. Maybe you can help me. And Wolverine basically says, screw you. So then he goes and gets drunk, and then the Weapon X people come and say, hey, we'd like for you to join us. And he's like, yeah, sign me up. Okay, you just said screw you to a guy in the government, and now you're saying, yeah, sign me up to a guy in the government. The only difference is the Weapon X people are saying that you might die, and I guess Wolverine has a death wish now that he's tried this thing and it failed and it fell apart all around him. I guess I don't understand. I think that was really dumb. You've got Magneto and Charles Xavier here. Both of them feel like shadows of their normal selves. Charles Xavier here, it's weird because Wolverine and Sabretooth, they go and they try to recruit him while he's in Oxford, and he's engaged to Morgan McTaggart, and she's talking about, hey, maybe we should invite your stepbrother Kane Marco, and he says, no, we don't want to do that, and she talks about how he's in the army. And then the next time we see Charles, after he tells Wolverine and Sabretooth, no, I don't want to join your team, next time we see him, he's in the army, and it makes me wonder how much time has passed in like the issue and a half since we saw Charles Xavier. It feels like it's been like 2 years, because he was at Oxford, then he goes to fight in the war, and now we're talking about the tragic loss of his stepbrother. Just how much time has passed, because when we're with Wolverine and Sabretooth, it doesn't feel like that much time has passed. It feels like it's been maybe a month, and that's stretching it. It feels like it's been less than a month, but then when we go back to Charles Xavier, it feels like it's been a year and a half. That's really weird. Time flows differently for different characters, I guess. So anyway, Charles Xavier basically is dressed down by Wolverine. Wolverine tells him, one day you are going to feel guilty because you could have helped and you decided not to. That's in like the first issue of this book, and then Charles Xavier basically does nothing throughout the rest of this book, and then by the end he decides he's going to start up a school for gifted youngsters. That feels, it doesn't feel earned. I don't really care about this particular version of Charles Xavier. I've seen other versions of the character where he's starting up the school and where we get to see him go from point A to point B, where he's traveling the world, fighting the Shadow King, meeting Magneto, meeting Amelia Voigt, where we get to see him in his traveling years, and then he decides, I'm going to start a school and train young mutants. And I feel like that story has been done better before. If you want to see a really good version of that story, go watch the movie X-Men First Class. The problem is, this treats this end of the story reveal as like a really big moment, like, hey, Charles Xavier is starting the school, he just put the sign up in front of the school, except that we get to see him like 3 times in this entire story. He's in maybe 5 pages throughout the whole book. Wolverine goes and says, hey, do you want to join us? Professor X says no. The next time we see him, he's in the army. He's looking at his file. He finds out about the Sentinels, and then he goes to the house where Wolverine and the other kids are, and then he rescues these 2 mutants and sends them on their way with their dad, and then the next thing we know, he's in his house ready to start school. And incidentally, he hasn't been crippled yet. That should have happened while he was traveling the world. But anyway, it's clear here that Christos Gage and Neal Adams have absolutely no concept of X-Men history, so that shouldn't surprise me that Wolverine, or that Professor X is still standing whenever he founds the school or buys the sign and, you know, puts it up in front of the school, because he was crippled while he was traveling around the world. Anyway, this book is really not good. It's not the worst X-Men story I've ever read, but I would say it is in the top 5 worst stories. It really feels like these guys just had absolutely no idea what they were doing. They were given a directive to just do something kind of like X-Men First Class, do this as a prequel to all the X-Men comics that we've read, except that a lot of people have filled in some of that backstory before X-Men issue 1, and this feels like it contradicts all of that. I don't think that this is very good. I don't really know who the audience is for this. It's definitely not X-Men fans. I can tell you that from experience. I don't even think that this would work for somebody who's only ever watched the X-Men movies, because this still feels like it's just cobbled together. The characters don't feel very interesting. The character arcs don't feel earned. So I don't even think that this is a good story for somebody who has never read an X-Men comic and has only watched X-Men movies. I don't think that anyone would really like this. I can't imagine anyone actually picking this up and enjoying it. So those are my thoughts on First X-Men. I hope that you guys liked this book, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.